When I first bought the land that would eventually hold my dream home, I thought I had finally outsmarted life. After years of grinding through my job as a project manager for a construction firm, saving every penny, passing on vacations and fancy cars, I had the down payment ready to buy a piece of property that wasn't just any suburban lot, it was a small 2-acre plot on the edge of a private community. It was quiet, full of trees, with a view of the hills that turned golden at sunset. The kind of place where a man could sip his coffee in peace without hearing traffic or leaf blowers every 2 minutes. The only catch was that the property fell under a homeowners association, or HOA, and at the time, I shrugged that off. I thought, how bad could it be? Everyone talks about HOAs like they're some sort of neighborhood police, but I figured as long as I paid my dues and kept the lawn looking nice, I wouldn't have any trouble. Boy, was I wrong. The problem started before I even broke ground. I submitted the plans for my home, a modern farmhouse style, 3 bedrooms, wraparound porch, big windows, to the HOA review board, just like the rules required. I paid the application fee, waited the required 30 days, and got a letter saying my plans were approved. That was a huge relief because I had a builder scheduled and a construction loan ready to go. I thought we were good to start, so we cleared the lot and started pouring the foundation. Within a week, a woman I would later come to know as Karen, yes, an actual Karen, showed up at my property, wearing oversized sunglasses, holding a clipboard, and radiating disapproval like she'd been professionally trained. She introduced herself as the chair of the HOA Architectural Committee and immediately started picking apart my build. "Those windows don't look like the ones you submitted," she said, even though they were exactly what was on the approved plans. She told me the porch railing was the wrong style, that my roof pitch looked too steep, that the siding wasn't the exact shade of white the HOA preferred. It was absurd. We weren't even out of the foundation stage, and she was already threatening fines. At first, I tried to be diplomatic. I pulled out my copy of the approved plans and showed her that everything matched. She huffed, told me she'd look into it, and drove away. 2 days later, I got a formal violation letter in the mail saying that my construction was non-compliant, and that the HOA board had voted to issue me a stop work order until I corrected the supposed violations. That single letter almost derailed everything. My contractor threatened to walk off the job because delays cost him money, and my bank warned me that if construction didn't stay on schedule, they'd reevaluate the loan. I spent hours going back and forth with the HOA, sending emails, photos, even inviting them to the site to inspect the build, but no one from the board would show up. It was like they were playing a game with me, trying to see if I'd just give up and sell the lot. The real bombshell came when one of the neighbors, a retired guy named Bill who liked to walk his dog past my place every morning, stopped by and gave me the inside scoop. Apparently, the HOA board, led by Karen, had been trying to buy my lot for years so they could turn it into a community park. They didn't want another house built because it would ruin the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Bill told me that Karen had been going around telling everyone that she would find a way to stop that house, no matter what it took. Suddenly, all the bogus violations made sense. This wasn't about siding or roof pitch. This was about control. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by blueprints, violation notices, and my mortgage paperwork, and I felt my blood boil. This was my land, my dream home, my money, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA bully take it away from me. I decided then and there that I was going to fight them, not just by appealing their nonsense but by learning every single rule and loophole in the HOA bylaws. If they wanted a war over my house, then I was going to play smarter, harder, and longer than they ever imagined. And deep down, I started hatching an idea. What if instead of just defending my home, I went one step further? What if I took control of the very system that was trying to crush me? After that night at the kitchen table, something in me flipped. I wasn't just a frustrated homeowner anymore, I was on a mission. The first thing I did was request a full copy of the HOA's bylaws, CC and RS, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and meeting minutes for the last 5 years. According to state law, they had to provide those documents to any member who asked. Karen tried to stall me by saying I needed to submit a formal written request and wait 30 business days, but I had already read the state HOA statute online, and I knew she was bluffing. I cited the exact section of the law that said they had 10 business days to provide documents or face statutory fines. That must have rattled her, because 3 days later, a manila envelope landed in my mailbox stuffed with everything I asked for. I spent every night after work reading those documents like they were a murder mystery novel. And let me tell you, I found some dirt. The HOA board had been operating like their own little. They voted themselves reimbursement checks for meeting expenses, charged random, special assessments, without proper votes, and even used HOA funds to pay for a private landscaping project on Karen's property. Every line I read made me angrier. They weren't just harassing me, they were abusing the entire neighborhood. Meanwhile, the stop work order on my house was still in place, and my contractor was breathing down my neck. I decided to appeal their decision formally. I wrote a 12-page letter, attaching copies of my approved plans, photos, and even statements from my architect confirming that everything was within the guidelines. I sent the letter by certified mail so they couldn't claim they never received it. 2 weeks later, I got a curt email from Karen saying the board had reviewed my appeal and denied it, no explanation, no justification. That was the last straw. Instead of getting discouraged, I started showing up at every HOA meeting. They hated. Karen would glare at me from across the room while I sat in the front row with a notebook, taking detailed notes. I began asking questions during the open forum portion, uncomfortable questions about where the HOA money was going, why the board wasn't holding open elections, and why certain projects were being approved without community votes. The more I spoke up, the more some of my neighbors started to whisper to me after meetings. They told me they were sick of Karen too, that she fined people for ridiculous things like leaving trash cans out for an extra hour or planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. That's when I realized I had allies, and allies meant I had a chance to do something bigger than just fight my violation. I started organizing quietly. On weekends, I walked the neighborhood with Bill, knocking on doors and talking to other homeowners. I showed them copies of the board's questionable spending. I asked them how they felt about the HOA. A surprising number of them were angry but didn't know what to do about it. I explained that the bylaws allowed for a recall election if a certain percentage of homeowners signed a petition. It would take work, but it was possible. Of course, Karen caught wind of what I was doing and doubled down on her harassment. Suddenly I started getting violation notices for things that weren't even real issues: my truck blocking the sidewalk even though it was parked in my driveway, my grass being too tall even though I had mowed it that same morning, even a letter accusing me of having construction debris visible from the street, which, yes, there was, because I was building a house. It became clear that she was trying to break me with fines and threats, hoping I'd either sell the lot or abandon my efforts. But instead of scaring me off, it made me even more determined. Then came the day that changed everything. I got a letter from the HOA attorney stating that if I didn't remove all unapproved construction within 30 days, they would pursue legal action to force demolition of my partially built house. That letter nearly made me see red. They were seriously threatening to tear down my dream home. That night, I sat down with Bill and a couple of other neighbors and said, "Enough is enough. We're taking the board back. Over the next month, we worked like a well-oiled machine. We canvassed the entire neighborhood, explained what was happening, and gathered signatures. People were fired up, they were tired of Karen's petty dictatorship and were ready for change. By the time we turned in the petition, we had well over the number of signatures needed to trigger a special recall election. The board tried to throw out some of the signatures, claiming they weren't valid, but I was ready for that too. I had notarized affidavits from each homeowner verifying their signatures. They had no choice but to set the election date. I could tell Karen was panicking. At the next meeting, she went on a rant about troublemakers and outsiders trying to undermine the integrity of the community. I calmly stood up and said, "I'm not an outsider. I'm a homeowner who followed every rule you gave me, and you still tried to destroy my house. This is about accountability." The room went quiet. Even some of the board members looked uncomfortable. At that moment, I knew we had momentum, and I wasn't stopping until the whole board was replaced. The weeks leading up to the recall election were some of the most intense of my life. I thought construction projects had tight deadlines, nothing compared to organizing a neighborhood revolt. Every night after work, I was out knocking on doors, answering questions, and reassuring nervous homeowners that this was the right thing to do. Some neighbors were scared to sign anything, worried that Karen would retaliate by jacking up their fines or targeting them. I understood their fear. I'd been living under that same threat, but I reminded them that nothing would change unless we acted together. Slowly but surely, support grew. Karen wasn't going down quietly, though. She started a smear campaign against me. Flyers showed up in mailboxes accusing me of trying to bankrupt the community and planning to dissolve the HOA entirely. She even claimed that my house would lower property values because it was not in harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. The irony was almost funny, considering my approved plans were literally stamped by their own committee before I broke ground. But it wasn't just rumors, she played dirty. At one point, she had the HOA attorney send me a letter accusing me of trespassing because I was walking door to door talking to homeowners. I responded by citing the state's canvassing laws, which specifically allow HOA members to go door to door for community issues. I copied the entire neighborhood on that email. That backfired on her spectacularly. Instead of scaring people, it made them angrier at the board for trying to silence me. Finally, the day of the recall election arrived. It was held in the community clubhouse, and the turnout was massive, the biggest anyone had seen in years. Karen sat at the front of the room, flanked by the other board members, glaring at me like I was public enemy number one. The tension was so thick you could feel it. I had spent weeks preparing, compiling a binder of evidence showing every shady thing the board had done, financial mismanagement, improper votes, even screenshots of emails where Karen mocked homeowners. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up in front of everyone and laid it all out, calmly and professionally. "This is not about me or my house," I said, looking around the room. "This is about every single person here who has been fined, harassed, or bullied by a board that forgot its job is to serve the community, not control it. The HOA is supposed to protect property values and make this neighborhood a better place to live. Instead, it's become a tool for a few people to get their way at everyone else's expense. Tonight, we get to change that." When I finished, the room broke into applause, something that had never happened at one of these meetings before. Karen tried to counter with a speech of her own, full of fearmongering about how removing the board would lead to chaos and destroy property values, but by then, it was clear she had lost the crowd. People were tired of being intimidated. Then came the vote. Each homeowner signed their ballot and dropped it into a locked box. We had arranged for a neutral third party, a local HOA attorney not affiliated with ours, to count the votes in front of everyone to keep things transparent. As the ballots were counted, you could feel the energy shift in the room. Karen's face got paler and paler with every vote that went against her. When the final tally was read, the result was clear: the board was officially recalled by a landslide. The room erupted in cheers. Some neighbors even hugged me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. But the work wasn't done yet. Now we had to elect a new board. Several neighbors nominated me on the spot to run for president. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I wanted that responsibility. Building my house was stressful enough, and now they wanted me to run an entire HOA? But when I looked around the room and saw the hope in people's faces, people who had been afraid to speak up for so long, I realized this was exactly why I had started fighting in the first place. I accepted the nomination. The election was quick and decisive. I won the presidency by an overwhelming majority. Bill was elected as treasurer, and a few other like-minded neighbors filled the other board positions. Karen stormed out before the results were even announced, muttering something about lawyers and appeals. But it didn't matter, we had the votes, and the recall was legally binding. The dictatorship was over. That night, I went back to my partially built house, climbed up onto the unfinished porch, and just sat there for a while under the stars. For the first time since breaking ground, I didn't feel dread every time I looked at the frame of my house. Instead, I felt pride, not just because I had saved my home, but because I had helped take back the entire neighborhood. The very first thing I did as HOA president was call a special board meeting, an open meeting, with every homeowner invited, to address the mess Karen and the previous board had left behind. I wanted to set the tone immediately: no more backroom decisions, no more secrecy. The clubhouse was packed that night. I started the meeting by officially lifting the stop work order on my house and apologizing to the community for the months of chaos. This board is here to serve you, not punish you, I told them. The room actually applauded. My contractor, who had been cautiously waiting on the sidelines, texted me that night saying his crew could be back on site within the week. For the first time in months, I felt like my dream home might actually become a reality. But cleaning up Karen's mess wasn't going to be that simple. As we went through the HOA's finances, we discovered all sorts of questionable expenses, hundreds of dollars for board dinners, landscaping charges for properties that weren't common areas, we all knew whose house those were for, and even a community improvement fund that seemed to have mysteriously vanished into thin air. I proposed hiring an independent auditor to go through every transaction from the last 3 years. Some neighbors were worried about the cost, but I told them transparency was worth every penny. If we were going to rebuild trust, we had to show that nothing was being swept under the rug. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done causing trouble. She started emailing homeowners claiming the recall election was invalid because of improper notice, even though we had followed the bylaws to the letter. She threatened to sue the new board personally. She even filed a complaint with the state HOA oversight agency accusing us of voter intimidation. The investigator reviewed the case and dismissed it almost immediately when they saw the documentation we had. Every time Karen tried to throw a wrench in the gears, we shut her down with facts and paperwork. It drove her crazy. One Saturday morning, as I was out checking the construction progress on my house, Karen actually showed up on the property again, demanding to see my new approval permits. I told her calmly that she was no longer on the board and had no authority to be there. When she refused to leave, I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and asked for a deputy to come out. When the deputy arrived, he politely but firmly told Karen that if she stepped foot on my property again without permission, she'd be trespassing. The look on her face was priceless. For once, she realized she wasn't untouchable anymore. Over the next few months, the neighborhood slowly started to feel different. People who had been hiding from the HOA started coming to meetings again. We created a community newsletter to keep everyone informed, set up a fair process for approving home projects, and eliminated a bunch of ridiculous rules that served no purpose other than to give the board power trips. Instead of threatening fines, we started offering friendly reminders and even helped some neighbors with repairs by organizing volunteer days. It was incredible how much goodwill that generated. As for my house, construction finally got back on track. Every day after work, I'd stop by to see the progress: framing, drywall, roofing, all moving forward without interference. It felt symbolic, like the house was rising not just for me but for the whole neighborhood. People would stop by and wave, even bring me coffee or snacks for the crew. Bill, now our treasurer, made a point to visit at least once a week to chat and make sure everything was running smoothly. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like part of an actual community instead of a battlefield. Still, Karen made one last desperate move. She tried to sue the HOA in small claims court for emotional distress and damage to her reputation. The judge took one look at the evidence we presented, the harassment letters, the bogus fines, the threats, and not only threw out her case but hinted that we might have grounds to countersue for the money she had misused during her time as president. We decided not to go that route, though. The community was ready to move forward, not get stuck in another endless fight. Karen eventually sold her house and moved out of the neighborhood entirely. The day the moving truck pulled away was the first time in years that the whole street felt quiet. That night, standing on my nearly finished porch, I thought about how far we'd all come. What had started as a nightmare, just me against an entire board determined to tear down my house, had turned into something so much bigger. We had taken back control, fixed a broken system, and built something better for everyone. My house wasn't just my dream anymore, it had become a symbol that one person can stand up, fight back, and actually win. The day my house was finally completed felt surreal. After months of battling, late-night planning, and more stress than I thought one person could handle, I stood in the middle of my brand-new living room, inhaling that fresh smell of new paint and polished wood floors. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows I had fought so hard to keep in the plans, casting warm light across the space. It wasn't just a house, it was a monument to perseverance. I walked from room to room slowly, running my hand along the smooth walls, almost in disbelief that we had actually made it to this point. Bill showed up around noon with a cooler of drinks and just grinned. "Looks like you finally got your dream home," he said, handing me a cold beer. "Told you it'd be worth it." And he was right. Every late-night meeting, every angry email, every piece of paperwork, it all led here. I decided then that the first thing I would do as a homeowner with a finished house was throw a party, not just for myself, but for the entire neighborhood. We planned it for the following Saturday and made it a full-blown community event. We rented tables and chairs, fired up grills, and set up games for the kids on the green space. People brought side dishes, desserts, and drinks. Some of them had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and told me it was the first time they'd ever seen so many neighbors in one place just having fun. We even had music playing, not the HOA-approved easy listening playlist Karen used to enforce at events, but real music that made people dance. When it got dark, I stood up on my brand new porch and gave a short speech. "This house was supposed to be torn down," I said, gesturing behind me. "But instead of letting that happen, we came together and changed everything, not just for me, but for all of us. This neighborhood isn't about rules and fines anymore. It's about community." The crowd cheered, and for the first time since buying the property, I felt completely at peace. As the months rolled by, the neighborhood continued to improve under the new leadership. We set up committees for landscaping, events, and even a volunteer group to help elderly neighbors with maintenance. Property values actually went up, something Karen had always claimed would plummet if anyone challenged her authority. People planted flowers, painted their houses in cheerful colors, and hosted barbecues without fear of getting a violation letter the next morning. The whole place just felt lighter. For me, the house became more than just a home, it became a gathering place. Friends, neighbors, and even people from other communities who had heard my story would stop by to talk about what had happened and how they could fix their own HOAs. I started writing down everything I had learned about bylaws, recall elections, and homeowner rights, eventually turning it into a guide that I shared online for free. To my surprise, it went viral. People across the country started using it to stand up to their own HOAs. Every once in a while, I'd drive past the house where Karen used to live. It had been sold to a young couple with 2 little kids, and now it had colorful flowers out front and toys scattered across the lawn. It was hard to believe that the house that once symbolized so much hostility now represented something as simple as a happy family's life. One quiet evening, sitting on the porch with a glass of bourbon, I reflected on everything that had happened. I thought about the man I had been when this all started, just a guy who wanted to build a house and mind his own business. If you had told me back then that I'd end up running an HOA, taking on lawsuits, and rallying an entire neighborhood, I would have laughed. But maybe that was the point. Life has a funny way of pushing you into battles you never wanted, just to show you what you're capable of. Looking out at the yard, the porch lights glowing softly, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. Not just because I had saved my home, but because I had saved something bigger, the sense of freedom and fairness that every homeowner deserves. My dream home had turned me into a fighter, a leader, and maybe even a better man. And as the crickets chirped and the stars came out, I knew one thing for sure: this fight had been worth every single second.